Hi everyone, my name is Paul Newfield. I'm the Director of Sector Research at Frontier and Chair for today's session on culture and looking at culture within investment managers in particular. We have a fantastic panel here today, and I'd like to welcome Mark Vish, who's the CIO of Vision Super, Sonia Bayers, who's the Director of Governance by Design and on the board of BusQ, and John Lucy, who's the CIO of Avant Mutual. We also have Sarah Cornelius, who's a senior consultant in our governance team and who has driven a lot of our culture-related work. We'd like to start off today with an acknowledgement of country. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which all who view this webinar are located. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. For a number of years now, Frontier has been associated with the Indigenous Literacy Program, the Foundation, and again in 2021, we'll be making donations on behalf of all the speakers to this very worthwhile cause. Throughout the panel discussion, please submit questions using the Q&A function. Please do not send the questions via the chat function. I would now like to call on Sarah Cornelius to kick off the session outlining the work we have been and continue to do on this very important topic. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Paul. So I'll spend some time now just providing some background on culture, why it continues to be an increasingly important area, and what Frontier is doing to enhance our assessment of culture as part of our manager due diligence process. In May this year, we released our Frontier line, What Lurks in the Shadows. And in this paper, we defined the key culture principles that we proactively seek from managers. And that paper is available on our website should you wish to read it. Recently, there have been numerous public call-outs of culture-related issues. And while we can't assume that something mentioned in a media article is fact, it can be a trigger for our researchers to investigate further and come to our own conclusions. Unfortunately, in some instances, there has been substance to these claims. As we see increasing incidents of poor culture being called out, it really highlights the potential of significant reputational damage and corporate value destruction. Cultural issues have clearly become a financial risk. We are also seeing examples of shareholders voting with their feet in relation to poor culture, be it by voting against management recommendations at shareholder meetings or by reducing or exiting their holdings altogether. Often cultural failings occur because society shifts and the organisation does not shift with it. As I mentioned, there have been a number of recent public call-outs of culture-related issues. In some ways, poor examples can be easier to identify. It is important to remember, though, that there are also positive examples of culture, and this slide just highlights some of the positive indicators. Each person within the organisation plays a role in the evolution and maintenance of culture. And so staff from all levels really should be accountable and empowered to call out behaviours that do not align with culture. Culture is broad and it covers many dimensions. From a funds management organisation, it also incorporates how a manager treats clients and its people. A successful culture will look different for each organisation, and it really is something that needs to be fit for purpose. There are some that think culture is less important, but I think this quote from Andrew Bailey from the Bank of England really highlights that culture is something that's worth spending time on, and there is a strong correlation between culture and major failures. So to enhance the assessment of culture within Frontier's existing due diligence process, we have defined a set of culture principles to set a standard, as well as a culture assessment framework to identify and deal with a variety of culture-related issues as they arise. Culture can be difficult, but not impossible to measure. And just because you can't always put a tangible number on culture doesn't mean it can't be measured. We just need to think outside the box. So defining principles and building an assessment framework so that the process is both defined and repeatable adds consistency and credibility to culture assessments. Frontier's research and due diligence process is now being enhanced to formally incorporate these 8 principles, which really outline the characteristics and traits that we proactively test and seek from fund managers, and which may also serve as signals that might point to a review of the manager being warranted. The principles are predominantly about how the manager treats its people, noting that culture and diversity do cover broader dimensions. We believe that a manager who treats its people well is likely to foster a positive culture. And in turn, this will help the manager to build and retain talent, making improvements not only at the manager level, but also the ethos and values within the financial services sector more broadly. We also acknowledge, though, the competitive environment that we operate in. So to be clear, it's not about necessarily saying high performance cultures are bad. It's about discouraging those inappropriate behaviours. And our clients are increasingly seeking culturally aligned managers. And this is partly driven by the financial consequences created by partnering with an unaligned manager from a cultural perspective. So this diagram shows a high-level summary of our culture incident assessment framework. The underlying framework is extremely extensive and also considers the required next steps, including meetings, policies and data to collect, the time frame, and goalposts, amongst other things. We fully appreciate that good fund managers are not immune from experiencing problems, and having a good culture is not a guarantee that issues won't arise from time to time. But it is how the manager deals with things when they don't go well that is most telling. Incidents can occur against expectation, especially given the human involvement. So in order to deal with culture-related incidents clearly and consistently as part of our monitoring process, we've also developed this framework. And the framework really helps to ensure consistency of our assessment and has been built around live cases, and we have used it on live examples since its development as well. We found this framework has been extremely useful. It's been tried, tested, and it's passed the test with our research teams in navigating such complex issues. This slide provides an example of key areas of consideration when a culture incident occurs. We find this helps enable us to make an informed judgment. As mentioned, just because you can't always put a tangible number on culture, it doesn't mean that it can't be measured. In assessing culture, there are various tangible concepts to consider. And the graphic on this slide illustrates how culture-related issues can translate into financial impacts. Each of these dimensions here have the potential to have a sizable financial impact. And sometimes it's also not the facts of the specific case that matter the most. And often in the case of discrimination or sexual harassment complaints, we may never know the truth. So the key focus in those cases is really in regard to how the organisation has handled the issue, the processes and procedures they have in place, what they're doing to instigate change if necessary, and what they're doing to improve. The organisation's level of transparency throughout the review process is also a really important factor to consider. So Frontier is placing an increasing weight on culture as part of our ongoing fund manager research program. We have always sought and will continue to seek fund managers who we believe have clients' interests first and front of mind, who can be strong partners with clients, and who can deliver superior risk-adjusted returns. So when it comes to culture, you might ask, what can asset owners do? And the answer here might depend on how far into the journey you are. But here we list some potential next steps. It includes considering where accountability sits with regards to culture in your organisation, how you measure success with regards to culture, and how the Frontier culture principles might apply to your organisation. You might also consider if any initial or ongoing training and education is required for staff, particularly at the board and senior management level. The final slide for me is about what Frontier is doing. We are building a more integrated and robust structure to assess manager culture as part of our due diligence process, together with enhanced data collection. And these enhancements will draw out alignment with the 8 key culture principles that I've mentioned. So now let's open it up to questions from the panel. And please continue to enter any questions you might have into the Q&A box if you haven't already done so. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Sarah. And that is a comprehensive summary of both the framework that we've built to assess culture when incidents occur, as well as the principles that we embed in assessing managers on a prospective basis. We have a number of questions. As Sarah said, if people could keep questions coming in the Q&A, but perhaps to kick off, and if I could ask all the panelists to unmute, perhaps to kick off, Sonia, you obviously hold a director level role with a number of organizations. You're involved with governance by design. What do you think are the key advantages in having exposure to managers which have alignment with asset owner organizations?
Thanks, Paul. And to answer this one, I think I'll put my director hat on of BuzzQ, which is a superannuation fund. So the experiences that I've had as a trustee have really shown that where there is a good alignment of culture, genuine long-term interests and partnerships are formed as managers seek to really provide solutions through their engagement with us as trustees, which results in better outcomes. As well as that, those managers get a deeper understanding of the members in our fund and therefore seek to look to the future and what does good performance look like for the future rather than just considering past performance metrics. So as Sarah said, I think it goes way beyond just the philosophy of financial consequences now, and managers are really looking to understand and build relationships.
When you think of, just one quick follow-up on that, when you think of those types of interrelationships, are there any kind of key attributes which stand out to you, key things that you've seen, even from kind of actual managers, you don't have to name names, but that you say, well, that just feels like the right connection for us as an organization?
Yeah, I think even recently Frontier's done some work for our fund where we had to make a really difficult decision because both managers were well rated. They both offered us what we needed, but one manager came in and allowed all team members to speak, and I think showed a little bit more of diversity of perspective in allowing analysts as well as the managers. So we felt like we heard their whole story rather than just one person speaking on behalf of that manager. I think allowing different voices is also important. Yeah.
Thanks. Mike, perhaps over to you. What process, you're obviously the CIO of Vision Super, a large fund. What are the processes that you have in place when you're assessing managers? We obviously work with Vision, the recommendations from us or the internal team, but what are the processes that you have, or the things that you focus on particularly in terms of trying to find the best alignment?
It's complex, Paul. Look, I focus on the people. You've got to take account of the organisation, but most of the people that you're dealing with at a fund manager, most of them want to do the right thing and help you. And it's partly about how you click with them, I think. You have to recognise there's different motivations always between different organisations. There's definitely there's quite a variation we find in just the relationships with our different managers. Some I would say are easier to deal with than others, but there's just different cultures. It's just part of weighing up for us really, but we do want to know that we're dealing with people that genuinely want to help us with where we're going, I guess I'd say. But we recognise all the other factors they have to deal with in their own organisations, and it's very different, large organisations and small organisations as well. It's a lot easier, I think, for the small ones in many ways, for understandable reasons.
A corollary to that is, certainly with all the institutional clients that we've dealt with, and certainly in experience in my career, is people say today, there's such a wealth of data-based information. There's lots of databases and lots of kind of detailed breakdowns you can get of managers. But at the end of the day, you really need to kind of meet with people and understand them as people, as complex people machines, not just kind of single data points in a big database. That's how you kind of unpick that, sense of culture, that sense of trust. How important is that for kind of vision? You spoke about kind of understanding the people, that kind of meeting people and really understanding them directly.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's very important. And we've seen it. You're seeing quantitative managers with exactly the same process and very different results, for example. So the people are always very, very important in how they implement, whether it's quantitative, fundamental, whatever. And the dynamics between them as well, is also, Sonia pointed out, it's extremely important.
Question for you, John. Continuing on the theme of kind of manager engagement, what do you see as the kind of biggest risks in terms of exposure to managers who might not be completely aligned? And what might be some of the kind of warning signs that kind of prick up your ears in terms of saying that might be something to explore? You're on mute still. You've come on.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Look, for us, we're not a huge, super fund and the like. So alignment with our managers is key. And, I kind of call it, will they pick up the phone, right? As in, will they answer the phone when you're calling, when you need something? And the risks if you're not aligned, your managers are an extension of the investment team, right? And it should really go through culture should really go through a process similar to hiring individuals. And if you wouldn't put up with star performers' bad behavior within your direct team, within your direct organization, you wouldn't put up with it with your managers. So your risk, all the risk is permanent loss capital. But another risk is you become disconnected with the drivers, the return drivers of the portfolio. You don't understand what's going on. You're not getting the transparency you need. And look, 95% of the time, everything will be sweet and it'll be okay. But it's the 5% of the time, the June 2020s, right? The crisis. You need liquidity. You need some sort of an understanding of what's happening within the portfolio. You don't want the scheduled quarterly call. You need an ad hoc update. That's where the culture comes into it. Is throughout the organization of the managers, are they willing to help you? Not just the investment team running the money, but the distribution team, the back office. Even when you give managers money and you appoint them, I've gone through, and I'm sure everyone else has gone through, remarkably different processes around negotiating an ISDA, and you haven't even given the manager any money yet, and it's almost like you're fighting an actual battle with the legal department. People just aren't on the same page within the same organization. So you see that quite a bit, and it gives you a feel of how important it is to not just review the investment team, but review the entire organization. One of our key governance processes is to go through staff engagement surveys, net promoter scores, things like that, outside of the CIO or outside of the senior portfolio manager giving you his spiel. You're talking to and you're getting in perspective from other people within the organization.
Again, a corollary for you. You talked about, managers which are kind of solution oriented, not just the investment solution, but kind of listening to the needs of what you might have at a particular point in time and kind of going the extra mile or getting creative to kind of find solutions to help you solve problems. A saying that I enjoy historically, and I do think about this a lot, while ideally you don't want any problems to arise, the very nature of the markets that we all operate across, macroeconomic and capital market conditions, means that sometimes issues do arise. And I think one of the sayings that kind of resonates strongly with me is, in calm seas, every ship's got a good captain. It's always easy for managers to say things are going well, or for engagements to be going well when the markets are flying or the alpha's flying, or there's, they're not on the front page of the newspaper. It's really the question of what happens and how they step up when things don't go disaster, but when things go a little bit rocky. Do they get on the front foot and resolve issues or come up with creative ways to solve a problem that you particularly might have? To what degree does that kind of resonate with you? And, do you have any kind of cases, again, without kind of revealing all what's in the kitchen cupboard, but kind of cases where issues have arisen and managers have really kind of gone above and beyond to kind of sort things out, and how that left you feeling after that event.
Yeah, look, I think it's critically important for smaller funds, right? That don't have a 40, 50 person investment team. The investment team is probably 5, 10 people, and your managers are really your kind of tentacles to what's happening out in the world, and especially overseas and the like. And we always kind of partner with our managers, or try to partner with them, because we don't have 50 or 60 managers. We've got like 15 managers, and the relationships that we have, we try to make them count. But like a few examples, again, March 2020, managers getting on the front foot, ringing you up, telling you exactly what's happening in the portfolio, what they're doing about it. Are they de-risking? Are they putting on risk? And what they're seeing in the market around liquidity, because we don't see that, but it's critically important for us then to feed that back to our kind of stakeholders internally, investment committees and boards. And that helps just ensure that everybody remains disciplined, process is followed, and nobody's panicking. And we've had a few managers that have done fantastic jobs on that. Just pick up the phone, give you a call, tell you what they're seeing, and tell you what they're doing about it and what their view is. We've got a global property manager who was recently, helped us out with some lease reviews and just given us some market intelligence around that. And then that's not part of their IMA, but we reached out to them just to get a bit of a market view, and all of a sudden they're kind of giving us some reports on it, and willing to sit down with our kind of executive and have a chat around that, things like that. So there's some examples there of just managers going above and beyond, managers getting on the front foot and knowing that you're not going to see this information, but it's information that might be useful for you. And a big part of that is managers understanding your business, right? So when we go through our kind of process of meeting up with managers, I always take a keen interest in the start of the meeting, and basically, what does the manager ask about your business, and do they want you to give them a 10-15 minute presentation, or do they just kick off straight into their spiel about them and how great they are and about how everything that they've done? Do they actually take the time to try to understand what you're doing, what you're trying to achieve, and what your portfolio looks like, and what kind of part would they play in it? And you'd be surprised the amount of managers that just kick off, and just and they've got no idea really about what you're trying to achieve in your business.
Yeah, I agree with all the points that you raised. Sarah, question for you. All of the principles, we talked about the 8 principles that we're now embedding to kind of assess managers against, to try and dimensionalize culture, and what are the areas to focus on around clients and their own people. Are the principles ranked in order of priority? Is one more important than the other? And if not, why not?
So from our perspective, we consider them holistically. So, we consider them in totality, and really they're all of equal importance. It may be in the case for some of our clients that they apply more weight to some principles over others. But definitely from a research perspective, we think of it more holistically. So one's not more important than the other.
And there are many ways you can come out with a great manager or a great team or a great culture. There's not kind of one singular recipe. So we do look at all of those. Of those 8 principles, when you think back, and I don't know if you wanted to either recall those now, Sarah, or kind of flash them up. But just a question perhaps for you, Sonia, is, are there anyone which particularly resonate with you? Do you think funds should or could apply a greater weight to any particular one of these in making a kind of stronger cultural assessment?
Thanks, Paul. I think what we're seeing is our members, and probably more importantly, regulators, telling us that there are certain areas that we need to focus on more heavily. So I think if you might be being directed But as a whole, probably support Sarah in the position taken by Frontier. All of these matters really cumulatively develop and talk to us around what culture is. So would I think that there's probably anything that we would focus our time on? I think there's probably definitely wanting to understand there's diversity of perspective and thinking in the management team that you might be appointing in that manager. Wanting to understand the transparency elements. So in preparing for today, I was actually being a little cheeky in my thinking, and in a way, managers are being dragged along rather than actually having taken a lead in some of these areas, because we as trustees, particularly on super boards, are now being told that in certain areas you have reporting obligations. There are expectations around what you need to demonstrate in acting in members' best financial interests. So we now need to flow that through to managers. And a lot of them haven't taken the lead on this. So some of these directions that are coming through, for example, Frontier, are also coming through from us as trustees, because we need to demonstrate to our members and to the broader market that we are taking into account these principles.
Just talking about best financial interest and outcomes. Two questions maybe for Mark, because it also kind of relates to super funds. The one question is, does good culture take precedence over performance? How would you deal with a manager who's a star performer but has examples of cultural failings?
Well, I think you've got to take every case by case. We're looking forward here. We're not looking backwards. And so you're making the best assessment you can looking forward. Depending on what the issues are, it may be something where you want to terminate, or, maybe not, maybe it can be dealt with. So we would look, I think, as much as we could to be open about what's happened, investigate it and make a decision. We're looking, as you say, members' best financial interests. So, there's things everyone does that you wouldn't do maybe, or you do it differently. That's fine. You've just got to make a decision. Okay, is there something toxic in here? That means they're not going to perform, or they're doing something that is not acceptable in terms of your values as a fund. And so, case by case, absolutely every time. Easy to say. It works out. Much harder to say.
I think, again, I would agree with all of that. And I think it ties back well to kind of two concepts that Sarah touched on earlier. So one is, it's my own view, one is that you can certainly get exceptional managers with an exceptional culture where sometimes a single event can occur. And really what we try to do is to unpack whether that's an exception because there was one bad egg, or whether it's systemic and endemic within an organization. And then the second part, I think, is really trying to assess, most importantly, how do you translate those cultural issues into financial outcomes, and looking at the dials that Sarah had earlier around the ability to attract and retain staff and elements of that nature. But I think for me, the word that kind of resonates, and I'll kind of come back to John to you for a comment on this, the word that resonates with me is kind of enduring, I think is a good word. I think organizations can be a star performer for a short period of time, but if you don't have an enduring support mechanism and kind of a strong collaboration internally, or if there are lots of kind of cracks building inside a big wall, eventually that wall comes down. You cannot sustain star performance unless you've got a strong culture, would be my view. John, did you have any comment on kind of that around the performance, or kind of my comment on culture?
Yeah, look, I agree. It comes back to 95% of the time it won't be a problem. But when the heat comes on and there's an incident, or there's an issue, or there's a period of underperformance, and we all want to try to look through underperformance and give managers the benefit of it, and allow them to ride out the cycle and ride out those tough periods. If there's cultural issues or there's lack of alignment, then that kind of waiver, that kind of buffer that managers gets reduced dramatically. So the cracks will open up, basically, Paul, for those managers, and 95% of the time will be fine. It won't be an issue. But when the heat comes on, that's when the relationship will fall apart.
Next one, which again is very kind of relevant for the current times that we live in, interesting times. And I'll start off with you, Sonia, and then come to Mark. When we're doing due diligence today, and a lot of that due diligence is remote, You can't obviously travel the globe. You can't even meet with local managers in the same geography. What are the techniques that, the challenges in kind of assessing culture, and what are some of the things that we could do kind of more? Is kind of Zoom sufficient, or are there other things that we could do?
That one's a tough one. I think we're all trying to grapple with how do you get line of sight when you can't see for yourself. I think it goes to the points that John and Michael have been raising, which is what's the communication style? Is there still transparency? Are we still hearing from our managers, or are they using this as a reason not to communicate? I think in terms of you can still meet with people digitally, you can still understand performance. And that's probably all I'd say to this one. I haven't really got any answers to how to solve this one. I think this is a hard one. Michael, I'm going to pass that to you.
So first thing I'd just say is, how well do you know any culture, including your own? It's always difficult. There's always a limit there. And I would say the more senior you are in an organisation, in some ways, the more difficult that becomes to understand what a culture is. I think you do get about out of Zoom, and it does give you some advantages in some ways, even while you miss out on, other bits of information, just seeing how an office is set up, for example, or just the physical interactions that you might not quite see on a Zoom call. But it does mean you can talk to pretty much anyone you want in an organisation. And that's when you do an on-site visit, you don't get that. Often, for various reasons, you will not be able to see someone. With Zoom, you can say, well, okay, set me up a time. I want to see this person when works. And so there are quite a few advantages as well. So I'm not sure we're worse off, to be honest. We're who we are. It's very hard to hide that, even on a Zoom call. So, it's a challenge, but it means working a little bit differently, but I don't think you're worse off necessarily.
Paul, I would second that as well. I've found we've got greater access, especially to overseas managers, greater access to the teams, and broader access within those organizations as well. And, whether it's, 7 a.m. call or here, or it's a 8 p.m. call here, it just makes it easier to organize. And, as Mike said, you can access more people a lot easier as well. So instead of, the senior PM and the CIO flying in over here and, popping into your office and then looking to go wine and dine you and things like that, you can actually just sit down, have a Zoom call and meet up with the COO, the CRO, the operations people. Just a lot. We have met in our team. We've met way more people in the managers' organizations than we had previously. So I find it really, really good, actually.
I'll come for a comment to Sarah in a minute. What I was going to say, from our point of view, I mean, we obviously research lots of managers across multiple dimensions as director of research. I know that, and we have historically, as you know, traveled quite a lot. I think there are benefits for certain instances in being able to travel, but undoubtedly we've also found other benefits from the Zoom experience, similar to what all three of you have articulated. We have had more access to more people. The other point is relates back to something that Sonia said earlier, is we have had a greater breadth of people at Frontier being able to simultaneously participate in a meeting. So rather than, two people being in New York or in London at a particular point in time, who are typically very senior people, and meeting with a bunch of manager folk, we can now have a greater number of people in our team meeting with those folk and getting a broader perspective of were there any warning signs or anything of that nature. Any views from yourself, Sarah, in terms of assessing culture and some of the challenges we face from remote? I mean, certainly, and again, perhaps without naming names, we have had one or two incidences that we had to kind of explore, which I know well, and just maybe talking through a little bit of how we did that on a remote basis and the types of things that we did.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit about, adapting your processes to fit with the circumstance as well. And, maybe it's perhaps, changing how you collect information. But as the other panel members have mentioned, it does open it up because you you sometimes get a broader access to people that you can speak with. So I think that's only a benefit, but it's just adapting the process to fit with the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And there are other ways that you can get the information that you might have got previously via, going into the office and sort of seeing how they're set up in a practical sense. So for us as well, it's also about enhancing the data that we collect. And so that's been quite a big focus of our research efforts as well.
As a general question to I suppose all panelists from tech, the question is, have any of you deselected or sacked a good performing manager on the basis of bad culture? If possible, provide an example, but it's not a necessity. Perhaps start with Sonia, anyone that you're aware of?
Yes, so when I first came on to the super fund, we had a very high performing manager. Sarah will probably remember this, generating great returns, but they were in a sector that the board was having philosophical discussions about and whether or not we wanted to divest from that particular industry and sector. And we attempted to have a conversation with this manager in person, and essentially we're just told that they weren't going to change who they were, and that was what they did. And there was no intention to look at sustainable investing through that manager. So that kind of terminated the relationship because they didn't look forward. So that's kind of the principles that we're now saying, is they need to look forward on behalf of those who they're investing for.
Mark, any examples from Vision side?
Not that I can recollect. We certainly cut back strong managers or strongly performing managers. I think I see alignment and partnership a bit differently to some others on this panel, but we always accept, I always believe that managers have a different objective than we've got. We look to do as much in-house in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Would we sack a manager that was performing really well? We would, but under what circumstances? And I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. It's quite a difficult one. And I've always found that a manager that's performing well typically seems to have a good culture. They're all, as you said earlier, it's all easy. None of them are shitting bricks. And then things can turn around and everything's really hard. So that's a lesson I've learned in my career. Sorry for the language. In my career. I don't know. I think it's a really good question. I'd like to believe that we would. We've certainly terminated managers that were performing badly, but I can't think of a circumstance where we've terminated one, we've cut back, but we haven't terminated one that's performing well on cultural grounds.
Yeah, that's a good segue to my next question, which I'll hold for a minute. First I'll ask John, and then I'll come back to a question that I had in relation to your comment. John?
Yes, we have, Paul. And, it was really a situation where we're reducing an allocation to an asset class, and, but we selected one of the best performing managers, and it was not actually the investment team were let down really by our back and middle office, and they were just too difficult to deal with, and just everything was just hard. Reports were late, and it was just difficult. So we just took the opportunity. They performed really well, and they just had a real bad attitude in the back middle office really, and it wasn't something that we could ever resolve, so we just terminated them.
Yeah. And as Sarah said at the outset, when you look at the culture principles, part of it is obviously how they treat their people, but part of it is how they put themselves in the client's shoes as stewards of the client's capital and kind of really service that, not just in terms of returns, but in terms of general service. A comment that you made, Mark, and I'll kind of go to all four of you. I'll start off with our panelists and come back to Sarah at the end, is you said sometimes things can look like they're going quite well, or they can be going quite well, and then they can turn quite quickly. In assessing culture, we obviously have kind of lifted the bar. We've defined the principles. We've kind of got a way of exploring those and trying to tease those out because we do think they're important. At points in time, you can discover a manager which you think has got great culture, but just because you've got great culture at a point in time, it does take quite a sustained effort to ensure that the culture itself is enduring. It doesn't self-sustain itself. What are some of your thoughts around, on assessing culture on an ongoing basis, or what might be some of the early warning signals, not that things have gone bad, but that they're on a trend in the wrong direction? Sonia?
Probably just reflecting on one of the managers who we've had for a long time, who's performed well over a lengthy period of time, and they are a value manager. So sometimes they perform, sometimes they don't. And in markets when they should have been performing really well, they didn't. And we probably should have been alert to that a little bit earlier. And on reflection, the benefit of that manager who does come with good culture was an admission that they'd taken their hands off the steering wheel a little too much and had negotiated a little bit too much down to their team. We probably should have seen that a little bit sooner on the board, but this manager accepted that they also should have seen that a little bit sooner. So I think those subtleties, although they might happen over time, they result in a big impact, which you then have to address. And this manager did and has done that very effectively. I'm not sure though, which is the point that Michael raised earlier, it's really hard to lift the lid on the culture within an enterprise. So it's what are the cues that help inform us whether or not that manager's staying true to form, I think.
John?
Yeah, I think turnover, the people will give you a good early warning sign of what's going on within the organization. So high staff turnover, good people leaving, that will, greater than what you would normally expect. You get a certain level of turnover that is good and it's healthy, but when it gets above that level, then there's generally something going on. And so we'll always look closely at the people, the turnover, and not just of the direct, the investment team, the support team around that. So whole of organization, and that'll usually give you a good early warning of potential issues with culture within an organization.
Anything to add to either of those, Mark?
Look, I think they've covered it pretty well. I mean, a dominant individual that doesn't allow other people to talk, that's often a sign, a sense of complacency. These have sort of been covered. Maybe lack of curiosity sometimes. If you see, you want your managers to be curious people, curious organisations asking questions. So it can be things like that. I think you do, when it goes badly wrong, you do see it. It can be uncertainty as well. It can be the uncertainty gets to be too much. You talked about your managers. Sometimes, the down cycle goes too long and people just can't tolerate it. It's the culture's not strong enough for whatever reason, or maybe there's an issue with the process, and you'll see that uncertainty eat away. It's tough. You don't want them too certain as well. You don't want them complacent, but there is a middle ground there.
I've got two kind of questions for you, Sarah. So one is obviously a continuum of that question. How do you ensure enduring culture, and what are some of the early warning signs? The second one, and I kind of got half a smile because we discussed this ourselves internally quite a lot of late, and that is, what is the difference between culture, seeing as everyone's happy versus a kind of star performance culture where there's kind of a performance orientated kind of drive and focus? Are those two things incongruous? I wonder if you had comments on both of those.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily to say that a high performance culture is a bad thing. but I think it's about communicating that and making the expectations clear, you know, knowing what you're targeting. I think if people don't know what they're aiming for, it you know, that sort of gets that sense of unfairness or resentment potentially. So I think if it's very clear what each person in the organization is targeting or being asked to target, then there's not a problem necessarily with the high performance culture. It's more when you know, things aren't clearly articulated, the team doesn't know what they're aiming for, what they're targeting. I think that's when you start to see the sort of more cultural issues play out, and then you start to see higher turnover and things like that. If you don't understand why you're not progressing in an organization, if the rationale is not clear behind that, then you'd sort of start to see that elevated turnover and other things that potentially lead to signals that other things are going wrong.
Thanks. Got a question here, which I might ask and answer, and then Sarah, you can add to it if you wish. So it says, in terms of when we do our cultural assessment of a manager, do we ask for details on gender composition, pay equality, and whether there have been any cases of harassment at the manager? Absolutely. So we've absolutely, not just on the diversity framework and kind of incidents construct for when issues arise, or information relating to the 8 principles when assessing a manager, but we do ask a lot of information today about gender diversity, about ethnic diversity at the board level, at the investment team level, who the key decision makers are, what are the pay differentials. We do ask if they have signed any NDAs or non-disclosure agreements. Some managers answer that, and we didn't ask for the detail of what's in the agreement. We just said, have you signed any? Some say, yes, we have, and we can't tell you the details because of obvious reasons. Some say we can't tell you whether we've even signed any. That's kind of partly telling in and of itself. So we are asking for a lot of information. For any managers on this conference call who attended our manager dialogue last week, you would have seen that we did provide a short example of some of the data that we collect in this regard, where we showed the level of gender diversity across over 300 rated managers by geography, to see which cities have better board diversity versus investment team diversity. But we have got our eye very sharply on these critical issues. Sarah, anything to add in that regard?
Yeah, I think the enhancement to our data collection process is really key in this, and you know, having all that data that we collect is really important, and that does help us then to identify trends, and it can then throw up signposts that things might be deteriorating or things might be improving as well. So I think they are really important to collect, and appreciate for some managers it is a little bit more work to provide that data, but it is really important from a research perspective, and I think it's important for our clients as well. It is disappointing when we sort of get the pushback that, oh, you know, that's, you know, personal information, we can't share that. A lot of the information is just more high level, you know, what's the number of incidents or things like that. It's not asking for those, you know, the intricate details of it. So it is disappointing when we start to get the pushback, and that does throw up a few questions with transparency, but that's a part of the process, I suppose.
The interesting part then, it relates back to earlier, John, around the ability of managers to kind of help have kind of mature discussions and solve problems. They've obviously got legal requirements from their own legal counsel, but we had 1 or 2 cases in point where we did ask not just one question, but kind of a multitude of questions around pay equity and split by level and by gender and promotional roles. And there was a limit to what they could say, but they were prepared to kind of aggregate that data. They were prepared to discuss it with us on a verbal basis without kind of putting it in writing. We're not going to now or ever disclose that in detail, but what we are going to do is use that information to make the judgment on those various dimensions, financial dimensions that Sarah talked about. Is there kind of fairness inherent in the organization? Is there a policy of construct? Is there discrimination? Is the team kind of bonded together? Is there a risk of a flight of people? So I think that too is quite important. Lots of questions coming through thick and fast now. Another one for you, maybe I'll start off with you, John, and then go to Mark. As a CIO, and again, maybe it's a learning or inference learning for managers. As a CIO, how do you position your own internal team's culture to achieve success?
Yeah, look, yeah, that's an interesting one. Look, we, again, try to apply some of the metrics that we use. Some of our managers to ourselves, almost like looking in the mirror in relation to diversity of the team, in relation to how we work together, giving the more junior members of the team an opportunity to have their views and the like in meetings. So we run given the size of our team, we run a very flat type of structure, but everybody comes to manager meetings, and we generally won't discuss any views after the meeting. Everybody will go and populate their reports and then submit their reports. So it doesn't allow any kind of bias from either myself or senior PMs biasing more junior members of the team, and then it allows for their views to be aired in a similar fashion to ourselves. So try to make sure that got that equality of views across the team, and it's not just one or two people kind of dominating the entire discussion. So we do try to look in the mirror in relation to what we would like to see, and look at our own turnover levels, look at our own engagement scores, and apply similar type metrics that we apply to our managers to the team itself.
Mark, anything to add on that from your perspective, building culture within Vision's team?
Yes, something to add. A couple of things. So one, we do get Frontier to run the ruler over us once a year. They run the ruler over us, and we don't see that paper until it goes to the committee. It's their perspective on how we've done. Now, possibly you guys are soft on us because we're a client, we can get you sacked, but we try, and as much as we can, you feel comfortable to do that as honestly as you can. The other thing I think I'd say is we do, in a way, try and embrace failure, because every organisation I've ever worked for, there's stuff ups all the time, big and small, and often it's not, success is not about making better decisions. In some ways, it's about recognising your mistakes as early as you can, and the only way you can do that is to make it easy, if you can, as possible. And it's always hard, but easier to say, we made a mistake here, we need to change this. That's what I'll try and do. As I said to you earlier, I think as you get higher up in an organisation, your ability to understand the culture and what people are thinking in your team gets harder and harder, and you have to rely on other people in the team for that to some extent. And that's what the scientific evidence does show as well. It is difficult. So it's really hard. You can't ask more than the best out of people, but a culture, I think, where you're recognising mistakes are being made, that you're making them yourself, and so is everyone else. I think you need that, a culture of where you're always making mistakes and doing nothing else but that. Obviously, it's not going to work, but you do have to recognise your limitations.
I strongly agree with you. I think embedded in the cultural principles, I'll ask Sarah for a comment now, is obviously that kind of growth mindset. We do want to focus on managers which have a growth mindset, not in terms of growing assets under management, but in terms of how do they continuously learn, how do they continuously refine, continuously improve, proactively seek out ways for improvement, look for cracks in the wall and see what can they learn to be better next time. And I think mistakes are opportunities for that. I think, even if you look at some of the best stock pickers in the world, they're not going to get 10 out of 10 stocks right every time. And kind of continually working at refining that, I think, is kind of quite important. Did you want to just touch on that, Sarah, quickly, around that growth mindset and how we embedded it in the principles? Yeah,
I think absolutely. It's about being transparent. It's about being able to come and say, look, we've had this issue. This is how we're dealing with it. These are the steps that we've put in place. I think that's really important. I think when you hear about something through the grapevine and you're having to approach the manager and say, oh, we've heard this has happened, can you tell us about it? That's not a great sign. And, we'd much prefer them to come to us proactively and talk about the issue. Just having that transparency and that openness, I think, is really important. And that's one of the key reasons that's been built into the principles. And yeah, it's really just about having the plan to move forward, identifying what the issue is, why it occurred, and what they can do to prevent it happening again.
Well said. Sonia, question for you. It comes from a fund manager. It says, businesses often talk about workplace diversity as a key performance driver, but some studies have shown that diversity strategies mean little without a focus on equity and inclusion. To what degree do you kind of believe that, and kind of any thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. So a couple of comments on this, one from my governance hat. Some INSEAD learnings with a scholar over there says boards love diversity until they get a taste of it. I think I'd share that perspective. And then taking the governance hat off, another learning is if you think about diversity in the context of being invited to a dance, that's great. But when you get there, being included is actually being asked to participate. So getting the invite to attend the dance is one thing. But once you then attend that dance, actually being able to participate and engage with the people there. So I think they are linked. And I think it's really hard to have diversity unless you understand and are prepared to listen to different perspectives.
We're coming up on the hour. I'm not going to ask kind of any direct questions, but before I close off, and we still have quite a large, sizable audience, listening, which is great that everyone's been engaged and lots of questions. Perhaps a closing comment from each of you, just your thoughts on kind of culture and anything particularly that you think needs to kind of either be carried up to a higher pedestal in the industry in terms of focus on culture, or anything you want managers to kind of take away to those listening on the call. I'll start with you, John.
Yeah, I suppose the takeaway for me would be that message around, look, we look at our managers and treat our managers as an extension of the team. So the culture within that organization is the culture we want within our organization or within our team. So, we hold managers to that standard, and like you said before, 95% of the time, cultural issues or cracks won't be a huge issue, but when the heat comes on, that's when those cracks will open up. So it's critically important and a huge factor in our manager selection.
Mike, any closing comments?
I think we've said it pretty much what we think. I just encourage managers to be open. We don't expect you to be any more perfect than us. Well, okay, a bit more perfect, but not perfect. So, I think we've said it all. Every culture is different. We haven't talked about international managers. I would say we don't expect them. We don't see, US cultures in particular being the same as Australian or culture managers. So there's difficult, is what I'd say.
Sonia, any closing comments?
Nothing really to add to that. I support both of those views, the transparency and accountability. Thank you.
Sarah, as someone who drove obviously all of our key content, I think you've obviously left people with a lot to think about, but anything you would want to close off with?
Just that, I think culture is an area that will continue to evolve. And so it's something that will be continuous on the monitoring front. And now it has sort of shown that it does have an impact. I think the attention that it will get will continue to increase. I
concur with all of those comments. My view is that culture will remain and will continue to be critically important. I think it is difficult to tease, not kind of a challenge we shy away from. I think the principles we put in place will hold us and clients in good stead. I want to thank all of the participants who've stayed here today throughout the call, and particularly all the panelists for your time. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of the day. Cheers.
Thank you.